Right now, it's my pleasure to introduce Robin Baird. Robin Baird is a research biologist with the Cascadia Research Collective, a nonprofit research organization based in Olympia, Washington. He first began working with whales in 1986, focusing on killer whales in the Pacific Northwest, with a PhD completed in 1994 on the foraging behavior and ecology of mammal-eating killer whales. For the last 14 years, Robin's research has focused on Hawaiian odontocetes, examining behavior and social organization, estimating abundance, assessing population structure, and using satellite tags to examine movements, habitat use, and behavior. If you're going to Robin's the website there, Cascadia, there's some amazing stuff on the tagging work. He's working off the Big Island, looking at animals that, frankly, not many people are looking at. So I'm really looking forward to what he has to say. We're honored to have him here. Please welcome Dr. Robin Baird.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for sticking around. Before I get started, I just want to mention that the work that I'm going to be talking about is really a collaborative effort. A lot of other researchers, a lot of professional and amateur photographers, and just people on the water who have the opportunity to get photos and contribute them to our catalogs. I also want to note that the work that I'm going to talk about has been funded over the last 10 years or more, primarily by the National Marine Fishery Service and in recent years by the US Navy. Now, just a quick definition of blackfish. If you look online, it's any of numerous dark-colored fishes. I'm not going to talk about that today, although later we could. The second definition is any of several small toothed whales, especially pilot whales. There's actually 5 species that could be considered blackfish here in Hawaiian waters. Pygmy killer whale up in the upper right, melon-headed whales in the lower right, shorefin pilot whales in the lower left, and then 2 others that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to give you a little quick primer on the other 2, false killer whales and killer whales. As you can see from these illustrations, false killer whales look absolutely nothing like killer whales, and so when you read online on a number of websites that they were given the name false killer whale because of the similarity in appearance, you should just ignore that. They were actually called false killer whales because they were first discovered as a skeletal specimen, and it's because of similarities in the skull between false killer whales and killer whales. And one of the main differences is actually in the shape of the teeth. False killer whales have rounded teeth in cross-section, whereas killer whales have a laterally compressed teeth. False killer whales are smaller than killer whales, but they do have a lot of similarities in terms of their life history between false killer whales and killer whales. Both are very long-lived. False killer whales live over 60 years, killer whales live over 80 years. Both species are very slow to mature, so false killer whales, the females are probably starting to reproduce when they're about 10 years of age. For killer whales, the females start to reproduce when they're about 15. For males, false killer whales aren't sexually mature until they're about 18, and it's about 15 years for killer whales. They both have very, very low calving rates. False killer whales, there's only one estimate of calving rates available, and that's 1 calf every 6 to 7 years. And for killer whales, the average is about 1 calf every 5 years. Females of both species go through menopause in their 40s and stop reproducing and will live another 20 or more years beyond that. And both species are also top predators, and top predators are naturally rare. Neither species is common really anywhere in the world. There are some differences though. False killer whales are primarily tropical and subtropical, and with the exception of places like Hawaii, false killer whales are also oceanic and open ocean species. Now, I first started working in Hawaii in 1999-2000, and at that point, not a lot was known about false killer whales here in Hawaii. This is a photo by my friend Dan McSweeney. He had taken this in the 1980s. He was out with a group of false killer whales. They had just caught an ahi, a yellowfin tuna, were carrying it around. This animal actually brought the yellowfin tuna up to Dan, spit it out and gave it to him. Dan was using a rebreather. He's just sitting down there. He kind of took the fish, not knowing what to do. False killer whale swam out, came in a big circle, came right back up and stopped right in front of him, and Dan, I think, good decision on his part, he gave the fish back. But, you know, that kind of prey sharing behavior was known, but not a lot else. Steve Leatherwood and Randy Reeves had done an aerial survey in 1989 off the west side of the Big Island and also elsewhere in the islands. their goal was to try to get a minimum count of false killer whales in the islands. There was interest in a permit application to capture these animals for aquariums, so they did these aerial surveys. They never published it, but off the west side of the Big Island, this is the area they surveyed in. They found a lot of different groups, including several groups of over 300 and one group of 470 false killer whales. So there were a lot of animals around back then. This is the cover of Hawaii Fishing News from June 2000, shortly after I had started working in the islands. This shows a false killer whale that's hooked on a long line. This was taken by the Observer program that the National Marine Fisheries Service runs on the longline fishing vessels. And at that stage, they were known to be one of the species that was most frequently taken as bycatch, most frequent species of whale or dolphin that was taken as bycatch in the longline fishery. So the work that I started in 2000 here off Maui, we worked off Maui in 2000, 2001, 2002. 2002 we expanded out to also do work off of Kona and Oahu. 2003 we expanded and also included Kauai in our study area. And this map here shows about 12 years of our survey effort among the main Hawaiian Islands, circumnavigating Kauai and Niihau, made some work off Waianae and the south shore of Oahu, in the Maui Nui area, and then a lot of work off of Kona. We use a couple different boats in our research. The Boston Whaler on the left-hand side is the boat that we use for our work off of Kona. It has a nice tower for steering from and a nice bow pulpit, which we use for photography and collecting genetic samples and satellite tagging. And the boat on the right is a 24-foot rigid hull Zodiac that we use for our work off of Kauai and Niihau, and we actually brought that boat over to a project here off Lanai in 2012. Now, I started out as a birder before I started working with marine mammals, and if any of you are birders, you know the birders are really interested in diversity, they're really interested in rarity. So when I started working here, instead of studying the common species, I did the opposite. We would go out in the water looking for whales and dolphins, and if we found something that was really rare, we would spend the entire day with them until we had to leave. And false killer whales were one of those really rare species. We also worked with bottlenose dolphins, shorefin pilot whales, and spotted dolphins, and basically, to a large degree, ignored humpback whales and spinner dolphins. Now, the work that we were doing included a lot of photo identification, so we built up a photo ID catalog of false killer whales that we were encountering around the various islands. And we were starting to recognize individuals from encounter to encounter and year to year. We were also collecting genetic samples, remote biopsy system, and those genetic samples were being used by geneticists at the Southwest Fisheries Science Center to look at the relatedness between false killer whales here in Hawaii and false killer whales elsewhere. Now, this story is supposed to be about two species, false killer whales and killer whales. It wasn't until May 10th of 2003, our 166th sighting of Adonocetes in Hawaiian waters, before we actually ever saw killer whales. Again, I said, you know, we would always focus on the least common species or the rarest species. So we were so excited when we found these killer whales. You know, if we could have, we would have stayed with them all day long. We were able to get close enough to get good photos of all four individuals. There's 3 of them here. And we're able to get 1 biopsy sample from the group. Now, for some of the photos that we've seen so far this weekend of killer whales, one of the things you've probably noticed is that at the base of the dorsal fin, they have this light gray or almost white saddle patch. And one of the things that we noticed right away with killer whales in our very first encounter is that saddle patch was much darker than what you see killer whale saddle patches in the Pacific Northwest or Alaska. Also much narrower. And that difference in pigmentation pattern suggests that these animals weren't some individuals that had come over from the West Coast, but in fact that these are different in some way, probably genetically isolated from the coastal temperate populations. Information was still coming in on false killer whales over that time, and in fact, in response to some lawsuits by Earth Justice against the National Marine Fisheries Service over sea turtle and albatross bycatch issues, the longline fishery went from having just a couple percentage observer coverage on the vessels to 100% observer coverage on the boats that were targeting swordfish and 20% observer coverage on the boats that were targeting tuna. And that increased observer coverage really emphasized that the irregular bycatches of false killer whales that we're getting were a real trend. They were the species of whale or dolphin that was being caught most frequently in the longline fishery. Now that interest or that awareness that they were being taken in the longline fishery actually led to our first ever publication from the work that we started here. And this was an assessment of injuries on false killer whales, similar to the way that Ed and others assess injuries on humpback whales to assess fisheries interactions. We used dorsal fin injuries to assess whether or not the animals that we were working with around the main Hawaiian Islands may be interacting with that longline fishery. So we published this little paper in 2005. These three individuals on the left, we had a catalog of 80 individuals from around the islands. The one on the bottom left has a line injury on the leading edge of the dorsal fin, and the fin is collapsed to the left. The middle animal has a line injury on the leading edge of the dorsal fin, and the fin's collapsed to the right. And the top animal is missing the fin entirely. There's actually scar tissue along where the fin was that indicates that it wasn't a congenital issue. The fin was actually cut off at some stage. And we compared the rate of fin injuries in false killer whales from our catalog to 8 other catalogs, actually 13 other catalogs of 8 different species. And the rate of dorsal fin disfigurement in false killer whales from around the main Hawaiian Islands was more than 4 times higher than any other species of toothed whale that we were able to find any information on. Now actually our third paper, even though we had still only had 1 sighting at that stage, our third paper on our work was actually on killer whales in Hawaiian waters. There was so much interest in our 1 sighting that we basically compiled as much information as we could on other sightings and strandings and came up with 21 records over an 11-year period. That includes photos like in the upper left taken by a sports fishing charter operation and our 1 encounter. Now, one of the things that came from this compilation of information is some basic idea of what killer whales here in Hawaii were feeding on. There was one well-documented case of them feeding on a humpback calf off of Niihau. There was a case of them feeding on cephalopods off of Lanai. The one animal that stranded on Lanai back in the early 2000s had squid beaks in the stomach. In the group that we had seen in May 2003, we first detected those animals because we saw a large school of melon-headed whales basically scattering and fleeing away from the whales. There are also other observations of spotted dolphins running away from killer whales here. So that early evidence suggested that they had a pretty diverse diet rather than just specializing on one thing like some of the populations of killer whales in the Pacific Northwest. But information on killer whales still was coming in very, very slowly. This is an individual that's stranded in October 2008 on Kauai. This individual is alive at the time. And you know, this animal was euthanized, and you can tell from this how emaciated it is. But one of the things that was obvious, again, you can see it has a very, very dark, almost invisible saddle patch. And the dorsal fin on this animal is relatively small, even though when they did the necropsy, it was definitely a mature male. So it again suggests that there may be some differences in morphology between the killer whales here and killer whales in the places like the Pacific Northwest. Again, we have a photo identification catalog of killer whales, as we do with false killer whales and many other species, in fact. As photos would come in from professional photographers or others, we would compare them to our catalog. This one's from 2009, and there were no matches whatsoever. So it's quite a contrast to what we were finding with false killer whales, where more and more of the encounters, they were individuals that were already in our catalog. Now, our second encounter with killer whales didn't come until July 24th, 2011. This was during a project off of Kauai. This was the 1,529th sighting of an odontocete in Hawaii, and only our second encounter with killer whales. So you can get an idea of how infrequently observed they are, despite the fact that our survey effort covers a really broad area and extends really far offshore. This particular case, our boat had broken down the day before, the one that we normally use and is a great boat for tagging and biopsying, and so we had to scramble and find another vessel to use. Unfortunately, the other vessel that we found at short notice was not a great boat for tagging or biopsying, so all we were able to do is get photographs of the individuals. we compared them to our catalog, and there were no matches. Now, going back to false killer whales, information on false killer whales is coming in at 10 times the rate, not just because of our own work, but also because of people like Dan Salton, Mark Decos here on island, folks on Oahu, and other folks on the Big Island. One of the things about false killer whales is they tend to feed on very large prey. They tend to feed on surface-oriented prey, so we're able to document what they're feeding on. This is a false killer whale with an ono or wahoo in the mouth. We see them feed on mahi-mahi a lot. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. One is that when they're feeding on mahi-mahi, they tend to throw them up into the air. They don't seem to do this with other species of fish. Why they like to throw mahi into the air versus tunas or other things, I'm not really sure. But the other, and I'll point out that this individual here, if you're really observant, you'll notice it has no dorsal fin. That's that one that I showed you the picture of earlier that had the dorsal fin taken off. But the other reason why I think we see them feeding on so many mahi-mahi is it's really easy for us who aren't fish biologists to quickly that as a mahi-mahi. They're unique in their appearance, and it's really difficult, certainly for me, to tell the difference between an albacore tuna and a skipjack tuna and a yellowfin tuna and a big-eye tuna when it's in the mouth of a whale and all you're seeing is part of this silver fish in the mouth. The other thing about their food is, I mentioned earlier that one that brought that fish up and offered it to Dan, is they also share their prey among each other. And that's not surprising. It's something that both killer whales and false killer whales and many other species of dolphins do. Although false killer whales tend to do it in a different way. We had one great observation where we had an individual and we could see other individuals off in the distance. And that individual caught a mahi-mahi and was carrying it around. We looked in the distance and you could see two other individuals that were coming rapidly towards this individual. And when they got there, the one that had the fish actually passed the fish to a second individual without actually taking a bite out of it. They're all adult-sized individuals, so we don't. If it was sort of a mother-offspring relationship, it was certainly an adult offspring. It passed the fish to that second individual, who then actually passed the fish to the third individual, who then passed the fish back to the one that caught it. And none of them at this stage had actually taken a bite out of this fish. So they were passing that fish around as if there was some sort of symbolic or ritualistic nature to that transfer. And I think it relates to the fact that these are long-lived animals. They have very strong social bonds. They're cooperative hunters. And they were basically sort of reaffirming social bonds. It's like going to a bar or a restaurant with your friends and buying them drinks, and then the next time you go out, they buy you drinks. It wasn't until all three of them had actually held that fish in their mouth that they started to eat it, and when they did, they actually all ended up eating part of it. We also get information from professional photographers that have the opportunity to get in the water and see what these guys are feeding on. And so we're learning that they have a pretty diverse diet of large pelagic game fish. Now, we've been using satellite tags to monitor movements and habitat use of false killer whales. I actually meant to show a zoom in of this area so you can see how often they come in between here and Lanai or Molokai, but you can see, so here's the Big Island, there's Maui and Molokai sort of almost buried in the dots, but you can see that they do come in the channels between the islands, although especially on the leeward sides of the islands, the west and south sides of the islands, they also move very, very far offshore. Furthest offshore, we've had individuals from this population is 120 kilometers. And when they are on the windward sides of the islands, which they spend about half their time on the windward sides of the islands, they tend to be much closer to shore. And we're not really sure what is causing those differences and how they use the different sides of the islands. And this basically represents the entire known range of what's now termed the main Hawaiian island insular population of false killer whales, basically from the Big Island all the way out to Niihau. From the genetic analysis, we know that these animals are genetically distinct from other populations of false killer whales. We are starting to get information on other populations, though. A couple of years ago, during a National Marine Fisheries Service cruise in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, they satellite tagged two individuals off of Nihoa. Those individuals did not match our photo ID catalog, and they moved up throughout the northwestern Hawaiian Islands as far as Gardner Pinnacles. In the last 2 years, 2012 and 2013, we've encountered false killer whales off Hawai'i and satellite tagged them, and they basically moved up into the northwestern Hawaiian Islands as well. So there appears to be a northwestern Hawaiian Island population of false killer whales, and that overlaps with the main Hawaiian Island population. And if you saw Hal Whitehead's talk earlier, he was mentioning resident killer whales in the Pacific Northwest, and this is really a very similar situation to what are termed northern residents and southern resident killer whales that overlap in their range in southern British Columbia and in Washington State quite extensively. They're behaviorally isolated, they're reproductively isolated, but they still to some degree share the same territory. Now there are pelagic or open ocean false killer whales out there as well. And we know that both because they're observed getting taken in the longline fishery. Samples have been collected from some of those animals in the longline fishery, and they're different from the animals in the main Hawaiian Islands or in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. And we also occasionally encounter these open ocean groups. We had a great encounter in October off of Kona, and this track in white here shows the movements of this group of pelagic or open ocean false killer whales that we satellite tagged. We actually still have one tag going from this group. It's duty cycled, so it's only transmitting once every 5 days right now. But on Thursday afternoon, it was about 1,000 kilometers due east from where we're sitting right now. So these open ocean false killer whales, instead of staying close to the islands in relatively shallow water, are basically using open ocean or pelagic waters and just using the overall habitat very, very differently. Now, one of the things that comes from photographs like this and observations of these animals in the field, as well as from the analysis of the photo identification data, is that these animals have very strong social bonds. And we've used the photo identification information to actually assess the strength of these bonds. This is a social network. Each one of these points represents an individual, and the lines between them basically represents those two individuals being seen together. The fact that you see this clustering here, that reflects the real strength of associations among these individuals. And we're scientists, we've called these cluster 1, 2, and 3. It's, I realize, not a very creative way to name them, and perhaps we should rethink that if we're trying to get people more interested in them. But these are, again, equivalent to killer whale pods. So these are long-term, stable social groups. The ones that have the little identifiers next to them are the ones that we've satellite tagged. And again, we have this really creative naming system. Each one has an HI for Hawaii, PC for Pseudorca crassidens, and then catchy numbers like 351. Or there's a 172. We're trying to work on how to get people interested in this, so maybe we need to think about naming them something else. But my point here is that these animals live in these discrete social units, and we have satellite tag data from 2 of these 3 units. And we know from the satellite tag data that they do different things. They overlap in their ranges, but they spend their time slightly differently. So cluster 3 individuals here in the right, that dark area that you can see north of Maui, north of Molokai, that's their high density areas. That's where they spend a disproportionate amount of their time. Cluster 1 in the left has a high density area off the north end of the Big Island, also has another high density area northwest of Molokai, and then a smaller high density area that's just to the southwest of Lanai. And that was an area that when we did our project off Lanai in 2012, we were trying to survey in that area. Now, one of the things that became clear as we were doing our abundance estimates with the photo identification data is that unlike the groups of 300 or 470 individuals that Steve Leatherwood and Randy Reeves had seen on their aerial surveys in '89, is our abundance estimates were all coming out between 150 and 200 individuals for this main Hawaiian Island population. So I worked with Randy Reeves, and we basically wrote up that aerial survey data from 1989 and compared it to more recent information, and basically it was evidence that the population had declined quite dramatically between the 80s and recent times. Now, I've done a lot of work with killer whales in the Pacific Northwest. There's an endangered population called the southern resident killer whales. So when this evidence of a decline started to become apparent, we thought, okay, if the population has declined, what could be the threatening factors? And so one of the things we did was look at pollutants. We worked with folks at the West Fishery Science Center, took our blubber samples and looked at levels of PCBs. It's an industrial chemical in the blubber. And one of the things we found is that every adult male in the population has levels of PCBs that are high enough to actually potentially cause immunosuppression. So that was quite alarming, as you can imagine. The Marine Mammal Commission basically gave me a small contract in 2009 to write up a status review of false killer whales in Hawaii. Joe Mobley provided his aerial survey data that extended throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s. And if you look at his aerial survey data, this graph up in the upper right basically had a tremendously strong reduction in sighting rates of false killer whales around the main Hawaiian Islands over that period. So now we've got multiple lines of evidence that are all sort of pointing in the same direction, that this population was, had really undergone a great decline. Folks like Dan McSweeney, who'd been working off the Big Island since the 80s, without being prompted, said that he had seen his sighting rates were much, much higher in the 80s than they are today. Folks like Chris Bain, who was the captain of the vessel Holo Holo off Kauai, said the same kind of thing. It's a real decline in sighting rates over time. So as a result of all of this, Natural Resources Defense Council ended up petitioning the National Marine Fisheries Service to list false killer whales under the Endangered Species Act. And so NMFS basically convened a biological review team that produced this report in 2010 as a status review, similar to what Phil was talking about yesterday with humpback whales. And it wasn't until 2 years later, but National Marine Fisheries Service listed this population, the main Hawaiian Island insular population, as endangered in December of 2012. Now there were other things going on at the same time, and that mainly related to that longline fishery and the bycatch and the longline fishery. Earth Justice sued National Marine Fisheries Service over the lack of action, really, in trying to deal with the high bycatch levels, because bycatch of false killer whales in the longline fishery were at levels that were thought to be unsustainable. So they sued NMFS, and NMFS basically set up what's called a take reduction team. The take reduction team brings together fishermen, it brings together scientists, it brings together conservationists to all try to come up with a plan to try to reduce bycatch. So the team actually came up with a consensus take reduction plan, which we submitted to National Marine Fisheries Service. And in late 2012, NMFS basically implemented that plan and went into effect in February 2013. And that plan has sort of two main components. Actually, the second one here is that there was 4 months of the year when longline fishing could occur closer to the islands, and the plan basically moved that out further offshore, so longline fishing cannot occur close to the main Hawaiian Islands for any time of the year, and that's to protect the insular population, because at the time it was proposed for listing, and everyone knew that it was probably likely to be listed as endangered. The second component was using weak circle hooks. For those of you who are fishermen, circle hooks tend to catch fish in the corner of the mouth rather than the fish ingesting the hook. And false killer whales, when they take fish off a line, they're often leaving the head attached to the line and just taking the body of the fish. And so using circle hooks should decrease the likelihood of the whales getting hooked in the first place. And the idea with weak circle hooks is that if it does get hooked, there's a greater chance, especially combined with this strong terminal gear, of being able to straighten the hook and get off the line. Now, going back to killer whales, November 1st of last year, our last day on the water, now we're up to sighting number 2,156. We're heading back towards the harbor, and I should say at this stage, when we go out on the boat, we carry a number of satellite tags on board, and we're basically prepared to tag a number of different species. Every day, Daniel Webster and I go through as we're either driving down to the harbor, or Daniel is the person who does the tagging while I'm driving the boat, or while we're out in the boat, we talk about the different scenarios. If we see a longman's beaked whale, what are we going to do? We're going to use one tag or two tags. Are they going to be location-only tags or depth-transmitting tags? If we see killer whales, recognizing at this stage we'd only seen killer whales twice in Hawaii in 13 years. If we see killer whales, are we going to put out 2 tags in the group or 3 tags in the group? Which tags do we use first? When do we try to get a biopsy sample? So we had actually talked about it that morning. You know, if we see killer whales, what are we going to do? And lo and behold, we found this lone killer whale. Now, I forgot to mention, our previous 2 sightings of killer whales, we had lost the groups after half an hour, 40 minutes. We just never saw them again. So when we see this lone killer whale, we're the only boat around. I am positive in the first few seconds that it's going to go down in a dive and we're never going to see it again. So I basically used up all the adrenaline in my body in the first few minutes of waiting for that whale to come back up. It did come back up. We were able to get close to it. It seemed pretty oblivious to our presence, and we were able to satellite tag it. Now, a friend who runs whale watching operations and dolphin watching operations over off Kona was actually near shore at the time, and so we have this one killer whale at satellite tag. So we call him up and say, well, if you can come over and watch this whale for us, we'll leave it and go see if there's any others around, because the chance of having just a lone killer whale traveling around in Hawaii seemed really unlikely. So they came over and basically took over following this whale. We went offshore a few miles, and lo and behold, there were 3 more killer whales out there, including 2 juveniles, subadults. They came right over to our boat, and were wake riding on our boat for a short period. Now, I'll point out a couple things from this photo. One is this animal has a lot of remoras on it. One there, one there, one there, one up in the back. Also has a satellite tag on the dorsal fin. We did that. You can see the ribs, and the question is this a really, really skinny animal? But the other thing you note, on the back, just in front of that remora, there's a little depression there. Sometimes people think when there's a depression behind the blowhole, it represents that the animal is actually emaciated. But in this case, that depression is not a depression that goes behind the blowhole. It runs along the body axis. And that depression is there because this animal is so fat. Those muscle masses along the dorsal surface are so enlarged that this is just albeit skinny in the sense that it doesn't have thick blubber layers, because it doesn't need to, because it's in the tropics and it doesn't need a lot of blubber for thermal regulation. Those muscle masses are represent that the animal is actually probably a really robust individual. And so Darren also got in the water and got this amazing underwater photo of the adult male that we tagged. And one of the things you can see from this is that this animal has the typical secondary sexual characteristics of an adult male killer whale, in the sense that the tail flukes are bent over, the pectoral flippers are quite large, but that dorsal fin is very, very small. For any of you who've seen killer whales in the Pacific Northwest, you would say this is a young male based on the dorsal fin, but based on the other appendages, it's clearly an adult male. And that again reflects the fact that this is not part of a coastal temperate population. This is from a totally different killer whale population. It just does not show the same degree of sexual dimorphism in something like dorsal fin size as other killer whale populations. Now, I mentioned we satellite tagged individuals. This shows where the group was on the second day. And Russ Andrews, one of our collaborators, went out the second day, found the group again, was able to get photographs of all of them. And you can see, I mentioned there were 3 individuals, 1 inshore, and now all 4 of them are together. But the next frame in this series actually shows 3 more individuals now on the right-hand side of that adult male. So there are actually 7 there the next day. We compared those 7 photographs to our catalog. None of them are in our catalog. Well, they are now. None of them were in our catalog. The second day when Russ went out, they also saw them feeding, and I'll show you a couple more photos of this, but this is a very large shark in the mouth of one of the killer whales. And I must thank Darren for providing a series of very nice photos that he was able to get the second day of them feeding on this pelagic thresher shark. And so again, here's the species. They've been seen feeding on humpback whale calf. They've been seen chasing dolphins. They've been seen squid in the stomach, seen feeding on a cephalopod, and now good documentation of them feeding on sharks here in Hawaiian waters. Now, I'll also show this video that was taken the next day by Julie Steelman. And this, it shows the whales. It slowed down, obviously. This shows the whales as they basically swam by carrying this thresher shark. And they actually saw, well, the previous photos that I showed you of Darren's were of one of the adult female-sized animal carrying the shark, and here it's the adult male that's carrying the shark. again, you can see how curved over those tail flukes are on the male, for those of you who weren't looking at the front half of the whale. Unfortunately for all of those photographers who live in Kona who really wanted to get out and try to find this group, by the end of the next morning, the third morning after we tagged it, the group was way, way far offshore. A week after we tagged it, it had already passed Cross Seamount and some of the other seamounts that are to the west of the island. This is 13 days after we tagged them. This is the international boundary, the 200-mile limit, and they just cross out of US waters into international waters. And this is 26 days after we tagged it. For those of you who are really observant, you'll notice a small island right here. This is Johnston Atoll. The whales basically went right by Johnston Atoll without any sort of diversion towards it. And at this stage, this is when, unfortunately for us, the tag stopped transmitting. But 26 days after they had been tagged, these whales were halfway to the Marshall Islands, which suggests that we need to expand the range of our photo ID catalog for killer whales. So if any of you have any contacts in the Marshall Islands, please see me after. Really, it suggests, which we thought before based on the lack of re-sightings from the photo identification, is that these animals are basically part of an open ocean population, a tropical open ocean population that may be using the entire tropical Pacific. Now, despite the fact that I know people like killer whales a lot, I'm going to go back to false killer whales. And this takes us to October 6th of 2013. This is a false killer whale that's stranded on South Point on the Big Island. We were able to match this individual to our catalog. It was an individual from Cluster 3, if you remember. That's the cluster that spends most of their time north of Molokai and Maui. And this is what some of the things that it had in its stomach, which includes 5 different fish hooks. Now, these fish hooks were in varying degrees of breakdown. There's a couple of them are missing parts of the hooks. You can also see that there's really four really different types of hooks there. 2 of them are probably troll hooks. The smallest J hook there on the center right is probably a recreational hook. And then those 2 big hooks, one of them may be a longline hook or maybe from another local fishery, we're not really sure. But this stranding of animals, combined with the fact that National Marine Fisheries Service had just announced that they wanted to prepare a recovery plan for false killer whales and the main Hawaiian Island population, prompted us to reassess that whole question of line injuries on these animals and whether or not those line injuries could tell us something about the rates of fisheries interactions. One of the big differences between now when we do this assessment and those earlier years is we now have photo identification catalogs of the pelagic population and also of the northwestern Hawaiian Island population, in part because of contributions from National Marine Fisheries Service and others. So we can actually look at the rate of dorsal injuries in 3 different populations instead of just the 1. So we had 7 different individuals, including Ed Lyman, score these photographs to assess whether or not the injuries of the animals had were consistent with fisheries interactions, possibly consistent with fisheries interactions, or not consistent. And we wanted to basically incorporate some of the uncertainty in these things. We just have photographs, we don't know what caused them, but we look at the injuries and we compare them to other types of injuries and say, well, it's more consistent with the fisheries interaction, or it's consistent with the fisheries interaction and not, for example, a vessel strike or a shark bite wound. And if the majority of those 7 people all agreed that it was consistent, which is 4 out of 7, and the other 3 all thought it was at least possibly consistent, then we basically said this animal has evidence of fisheries interactions. And the results are right there. For the pelagic population, 73 individuals in our catalog, and none of them have injuries that were categorized as consistent with fisheries interactions. And that's for a population that we know is regularly interacting with the longline fishery at a rate that is higher than the population is thought to be able to sustain. The northwestern Hawaiian Island population, none of the 63 individuals in our catalog have these types of injuries. That's not very surprising because there's not really any fishing now in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, and there never really been much. So it seems unlikely there would be much in the way of interactions. But almost 7% of our main Hawaiian Island catalog has evidence of these types of interactions. Now, one of the things we know, as I mentioned, is that there's these 3 different social clusters. So we decided to look at whether or not there was variability in the social clusters in terms of the rate of fisheries interactions. I mentioned that the animals stranded with the fish hooks came from cluster 3. And in fact, we find that cluster 1, only 3% of the individuals have this type of evidence. Cluster 2, 7% of the individuals have this type of evidence. Whereas cluster 3, it's 12% of the individuals. So it seems like cluster 3 individuals are basically interacting with fishing operations at much higher rates than any of the other 2 social clusters. And in hindsight, that's not really very surprising because, again, these are long-lived social foragers. They share information on how to hunt. They cooperatively hunt. And I think probably what happened at some point in the past is that some individuals learned that getting fish from fishermen was probably an easy way to get fish, and they passed that information on to their friends and relatives. The more disturbing thing is that when we looked at the average annual mortality rates for these 3 social clusters, we see an increase in mortality rates by social cluster that's basically correlated with the increase in the proportion of individuals that have evidence of these fisheries interactions. So it's only a 1% increase from 3 to 4 for mortality rates, but that's really a third higher for cluster 2 than it is for cluster 1. And you know, these differences are small, but they could represent a couple individuals per year that may be dying as we believe from these types of fisheries interactions. And this again is from the main Hawaiian Island insular population. So it seems like somewhat of a depressing story, but in fact, one of the things that happened in that take reduction team is a bunch of fishermen and a bunch of scientists got together and tried to come up with a plan that would reduce bycatch in longline fisheries. And it seems to me there's actually a really, at least short-term solution that could be put into place, or potential solution to try to deal with this, which is to take the same types of recommendations for things like weak circle hooks and implement them in some of the coastal fisheries that these animals may be interacting with. Obviously, you know, for that to happen, National Marine Fisheries Service would have to invite representatives of a lot of the local fisheries onto the take reduction team and go through that particular process. So I want to end by going back to where I mentioned at the beginning when I gave the acknowledgements, which is a lot of what we know about these animals has come from really a team approach, both within the organization that I work for and a lot of collaborating individuals and collaborating organizations. One of the reasons why I'm happy to be here today and this weekend is the opportunity to work with a lot of the folks here to try to encourage you guys that if you're on the water, if you're doing research, if you're doing whale watching operations, if you're out taking photographs and you ever have the opportunity to get photographs of false killer whales, those photographs are not just valuable for looking at sort of esoteric things like how do individuals move between islands, but they can also be used to help assess things like these fisheries interactions. And even we've discovered recently that GoPro footage is a great way to get identification photographs of animals like false killer whales that bow ride for very subtly marked individuals that, a surface photo we wouldn't be able to identify it, but it turns out if you can get a full body image, you can see all the subtle body scars, so we can match those between encounters. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Dr. Robin Baird, everybody. And I think we have time for a couple questions if you have in the audience.
Can you comment on the television program that was presented last year on killer whales in SeaWorld in Florida?
So, which program are you talking about? Blackfish? Yes, I could comment. Next question, please. Who said that yesterday?
Thank you for everything that you had mentioned, or just really quickly, briefly, that one of those orca was a subadult. Would that be the breeding?
Oh, and so the question is, the group of 4 that we saw, one of them was a subadult, actually. I think 2 of them were subadult, and whether or not they were breeding. Are you asking in terms of whether or not that group may have been a breeding group?
Right. Are they grow? Did they grow?
Oh, well, so I mean, killer whales and false killer whales, and this is pretty well established from genetic studies, tend not to breed within the groups, they breed between the groups. Certainly, the killer whale population, you know, it's relatively small in Hawaiian waters, but because their range is so large, it's actually probably a relatively large population over the whole sort of central tropical Pacific. There's no evidence one way or another to say whether the population is increasing or decreasing. But you know, despite the fact that you can see the ribs on that animal, I actually think that all the animals in that group look very robust and healthy. And so in the sense that there were 2 juveniles out of a group of 4, it does imply that, you know, the populations did not, like we found 4 adult whales. And that other slide I showed of the other 3 individuals there's 1 adult and 2 subadults. So really it's 4 subadults out of 7 individuals, which suggests that population is probably doing quite well.
Do you ever compare the killer whale Hawai'i with the South?
Yeah, no, the question was whether or not we've compared the photos of killer whales that we've obtained in Hawaiian waters with the Southwest Fishery Science Center has a catalog from the Eastern Tropical Pacific that Paula Olson curates. We actually haven't sent her the most recent 7 individuals, so I'm planning on it, but we have sent her the previous ones that we've obtained, and she hasn't found any matches either. And you know, whether or not that suggests that their catalog is relatively small compared to the overall population size, or that the Hawaiian animals may go further west but not further east at this stage, we can't really say. But just sort of along similar lines with false killer whales, with that pelagic catalog and the Northwestern Hawaiian Island catalog, we have 63 and 71 individuals, I think, and there's only actually 1 resighting from the pelagic catalog and no resightings from the Northwestern Hawaiian Island catalog, which suggests the populations are much larger than what we're finding in the main Hawaiian Island false killer whale population. So to give you an example, if we find that cluster 1 false killer whales, if someone gets a photographs of 10 individuals from cluster 1, probably all 10 of them are already in our catalog. Whereas we had this encounter with a pelagic group of false killer whales in October, and we got IDs of 16 individuals, none of which are in our catalog. So the same thing, I'm not surprised that we're not finding resightings of killer whales at this stage, because I think it's probably a much larger catalog, and we have just a relatively small number of photos.
Have you compared the PCB levels with other whales?
Well, it's interesting. The question was whether we've compared the PCB levels with other whales. You know, prior to finding the evidence that the main Hawaiian Island insular population was declining, a number of folks had asked me in public talks whether or not we were looking at pollutant levels, and I always said no, because I think it's a really pristine environment around Hawaii, and as it turns out, I was just very naive. And in hindsight, it's not a pristine environment out there, because a lot of these chemicals basically are transported through the atmosphere, they're transported through the ocean, they're transported through the food web. So places like Hawaii are not even remotely immune to the types of industrial dumping and so pesticide use elsewhere in the world, nonetheless, what may or may not be going on here. That said, there really hasn't been much done with other species yet, although Hawaii Pacific University has started some of that work with some of the samples we've obtained, and also with samples that they're getting from the stranding network. I would think actually that false killer whales, among most of the species of whales and resident whales and dolphins in Hawaii, probably have the highest levels, or among the highest levels of any species, because they're at the top of the food web. And a lot of other things are just feeding much lower on the food web, so their prey has not bioaccumulated such high levels of toxins.
When a fisherman finds a false killer whale on long line, is that false killer whale dead or alive?
So the question was, when fishermen find false killer whales on a long line, is it dead or alive? And so we only really know when there's observers on board. When there's no observers there, they tell us they don't actually catch any. You know, a small proportion of them are dead at the time. A certain proportion of them are released alive without any gear attached. and those animals are considered to basically be, well, they're not considered to have a serious injury. If they're released with no fishing gear attached, they're thought to be fine. But what happens is that a fairly large number of them are released with, they've either ingested the hook and they may have a lot of trailing gear behind, or they may have the line wrapped around the peduncle, that kind of thing. And so when that happens, a group of people at National Marine Fisheries Service basically review photos, review video, review all the notes that the observers took, and assess whether or not it had a serious injury that may have a greater than 50% chance of leading to death or not. So, one more question.
Who are these longliners and what is their range?
So the question was, who are the longliners and what is their range? And this is a Hawaii-based, well, this is a U.S. fleet, a Hawaii-based U.S. fleet. Most of them are offloading in Honolulu. There's about 125 plus or minus vessels. They will fish really hundreds and hundreds of miles north or south of the islands in international waters. They actually probably spend more time, well, they do spend more time in international waters than they do spend in U.S. waters. And, you know, well, that track I showed of the pelagic false killer whale that was going off to the east, that animal left U.S. waters about 30 days after we tagged it and spent the rest of its time in international waters. And while there's the U.S. fleet in international waters, there's also a number of other foreign vessels that fish in the central tropical Pacific in international waters. So when false killer whales are out in international waters, they're interacting, I think, with far more vessels than just what's represented by the U.S. fleet. So, thank you very much.
Dr. Robin Baird, thank you.